So Shahzad, how are you?
Yeah. Sir, shall we start?
Yes, please.
Yeah. So thank you very much, all the panelists and all the participants yes, from around the world who have joined us for this important webinar that CASS is hosting. We understand that it's very early morning in Washington, and in Pakistan it's close to time of breaking fast. So both Washington and Islamabad probably it might be a bit difficult to catch that attention or grab that, maintain focus. But I appreciate all the participants. Let me introduce myself. I'm Adil Sultan, Director Nuclear and Strategic Affairs at the Center for Aerospace and Security Studies and moderator for today's event. On behalf of the President and my fellow staff members at CASS, I welcome you all to our webinar that will aim to understand the dynamics of recent Kashmir crisis and the ongoing tension along the line of control. Those who follow the regional dynamics would understand that the frequency of crises between India and Pakistan has increased. Or one can state that we are now in a perpetual state of crises with continuous military engagements along the line of control. To understand whether this would be a new normal for the region and what could be done to prevent this dangerous situation, we have with us today an excellent panel of experts that include Dr. Toby Dalton from Carnegie Endowment for International Peace, Washington, D.C., Air Vice Marshal retired Shahzad Chaudhry, and Dr. Rabia Akhtar from University of Lahore. The panel of experts in their remarks will aim to address some of the following questions. How serious is the current crisis, and will it lead to another military conflict between the two nuclear-armed neighbors? What would be the role of the international community in preventing or diffusing the next crisis, especially when it is embroiled in dealing with the pandemic? And does warmongering and hostile rhetoric make any sense in the current peculiar environment? Another question, or three more questions that we would want the panelists to address is, if the major powers remain reluctant to intervene in lowering the temperature, would it be possible for India and Pakistan to manage the crisis on their own? And with India's claims of surgical strikes being a new normal and Pakistan's policy of quid pro quo plus, what could be the nature of a next military crisis? And can a surgical strike change the domestic Indian reality? Finally, in view of the rising influence of Hindutva at the senior decision-making level, is there a space to manage India-Pakistan relations through a dialogue? Before we start our panel discussion, I request my panelists to start make their statements. Some administrative announcements. I'll request all the other panelists who are not speaking to keep their mics off to avoid any disturbance. And in case there is a technical hitch, because we have heard that some problems are being faced by Zoom since yesterday, so all the participants and the panelists will receive a new password and login. And we hope that we'll be able to resume within 10 minutes. And finally, all the panelists will have 8 to 10 minutes to make this statement. I will request that they stick to their time. Now, coming to our first panelist, Dr. Toby Dalton, who is an old friend, and we often agree to disagree on issues of our common interest, but respect each other's perspective very, very well. Toby is a co-director and a senior fellow of the Nuclear Policy Program at Carnegie Endowment for International Peace. His work addresses regional security challenges and evolution of global nuclear order, focusing on South Asia and East Asia. He is a co-author of a book, Not War, Not Peace, Motivating Pakistan to Prevent Cross-Border Terrorism, a title that I always disagreed with Toby. This book, nevertheless, provides an in-depth analysis of the conflict spectrum in South Asia, and it's an excellent read. From 2002 to 2010, Toby served in a variety of high-level positions at the US Department of Energy. He also established and led department's office at the US Embassy in Pakistan from 2008 to 2009, and that is the first time we and Toby met, and we were working for our respective governments on nuclear-related issues. And subsequently, we continue to remain engaged as academics also. So Toby, over to you.
Oh, great. Thank you so much, Adil. It's great to be with you and a real pleasure to share the screen with all of my fellow panelists this morning or afternoon for you, I guess. And thanks to the Center for Aerospace and Security Studies for convening this important and timely discussion. I wanted to kind of start by offering some ideas about how I've come to think about this issue as I've pondered it over the last few months. And I really want to thank Adil for spurring me to write an article and published in Straff Asia, the online platform, to kind of cohere my thoughts. It's sometimes it requires some outside motivation to get you to put things down on paper, and so it's great to have that out there, and that'll be the basis for my remarks today, is the article that I contributed. I want to preface what I'm going to say by offering a note of humility, which is that when you're 11,000 kilometers away from a problem space, it's sometimes difficult to see events, and that obviously leads to potential differences in interpretation. It's quite plausible that sitting far away, I miss key details and so forth. It's also really difficult, I find, increasingly, and more so these days, where it is not possible to travel as widely and sort of get a sense of ground realities, to kind of do the dispassionate analysis while also gaining an empathetic understanding of how people on the ground are viewing a situation. And so for me, that's kind of an important caveat as I think about the way that I've come to view what's happening between India and Pakistan. So thinking back to the Pulwama Balakot situation about 15 months ago, the crisis in February of 2019, and what it means. And in particular, I'm interested in the political narratives that have been crafted by India and Pakistan to explain those events, and also to foreshadow how a future crisis might unfold, to kind of create expectations, and also to, in theory, bolster deterrence. My interpretation of that crisis and the events subsequent to it is heavily influenced by the work that George Perkovich and I had done previously in the book that you referenced, Not War, Not Peace, where we tried to understand the situation and the options that were being debated in India at that time. And so that analysis that we conducted in that book still influences how I see this situation. And I think the key observation that I would make is that neither the Uri surgical strikes or the airstrikes that the Indian Air Force conducted at Balakot rose to the level of violence that we imagined in that analysis would lead to escalation of the crisis that would threaten nuclear use. Both of those activities were calibrated mainly for, I think, domestic political purposes, not for substantial military effect or even longer term deterrent effect. And I think that's an important observation, because that in thinking about activities or actions or intentions to fundamentally change the structure of the situation between India and Pakistan, we haven't seen it, right? The Balakot crisis did not structurally change this issue in important ways. So with that, let me offer 3 points about this new normal narrative that seems to be proclaimed in both countries. First, obviously, the use of air power at Balakot, first by India and then in the retaliatory strikes by Pakistan for cross-border strikes, that is new, right? The new part of this narrative of new normal is clear. It's new in the nuclear age in South Asia. And it crossed what I gather is an important threshold, both ideationally, but also militarily, right? This is a new dynamic to account for. It showed some willingness by both states to risk further escalation. That said, we also have to recognize the role of luck and how that crisis evolved. It could have been different. It could have gone differently. But there was also tactical choices, I gather, that were made that shaped very much the escalation potential. And it didn't escalate further, in my view, mainly because escalation didn't really serve the political interests of either state at the end of the day. And I think both leaderships made wise choices to de-escalate and sort of declare victory at the end of that crisis. So that's point one. Point two, in thinking about the new normal narrative, the word normal is a very loaded word. I don't think warfare should be normalized in this way, and the expectation of warfare should be normalized. I say that with recognition that my own country's practices in this regard might leave a different impression. But this, the sort of crafting of this narrative was meant to suggest a new paradigm, that the future events in South Asia would be more violent, kind of more along the lines of the Indian airstrike, and that there would be more punitive Indian attacks on targets in Pakistan, presumably in response to some provocation and a terrorist attack attributed to groups based in Pakistan, for instance. And if you look back at the track record of Pakistani diplomacy for most of 2019, it was focused on raising international awareness of the potential for further Indian aggression kind of under the rubric of this new normal. But over the last 15 months, it hasn't happened. It doesn't mean it won't happen, but I think there's good reason to think that, as I had suggested earlier, this is not a new paradigm. There's not some structural change in the parameters of the problem. And mainly those parameters relate to the political and economic interests of both states, the military capabilities of both states, and of course, the threat of mutual nuclear annihilation if things get out of hand. And in that regard, if you kind of look at the return to cross-border shelling as a normal thing, we're more back to the old normal as the vector of military engagement rather than the new normal. So that's point two that I would make. The third point is that the new normal narrative, I think, is distracting. It actually masks what I gather in Pakistan is the more important concern, which really has nothing to do with how India might respond to future provocations, but everything to do with who Modi is in India and the Hindu nationalist threat to Muslims that he is perceived to represent. And this conflation, I think, is problematic because it makes it harder. You know, the analysis gets muddled between Modi as an individual who might be more risk acceptant and then the actions at Balakot. And specifically, I gather that the fear in Pakistan is that Modi's success in implementing majoritarian domestic politics, coupled with a fairly tepid international condemnation of his actions in Kashmir specifically and against Indian Muslims in general, will embolden him to try something more against Pakistan. And clearly you can identify fairly regular statements from Indian officials about going after POK, first Kashmir, next Gilgit-Baltistan. These statements are there. You can't deny this evidence. I noticed earlier today a post on Facebook, in case anyone has appetite for a Zoom session after your iftar dinner, that the Central University in Gujarat is having a seminar this evening that is Gilgit-Baltistan, a roadmap, ? I'm not sure how to interpret that. I just note it and see that there are discussions ongoing in India that could feed perceptions of intention to somehow try to change territory. So these developments, both the new normal narrative, but also then the kind of how you interpret Modi, clearly have animated the security community in Pakistan. It's not for me to say whether this is right or not right, real or not real. Perceptions obviously matter. And so as an analyst, I try to see both the big picture and also the important details. And as I look at this, Modi himself and Indian domestic politics are important details, but do they change the big picture? Pakistan has nuclear weapons. Most people seem to think that nuclear weapons deter changes to territorial status quo. Neither country seems to have the capability to win decisively in a war. Both have economic and international political priorities that militate against protracted warfare. So these structural conditions have not really changed, despite the change in the character of the Indian leadership. So I guess the bottom line for me is that the new part may be new, but normal part may not be so different, right? The old normal and the new normal may look very similar. There may be periodic violence, but by and large, that violence is relatively stable. I think both states know how to handle this. Is it good? Is it bad? I leave that to you. I think personally, I think that's a unsatisfactory situation. But it's one that, as we captured in the "Not War, Not Peace" title of our book, it seems to be an unfortunate conundrum that both states can't escape from. I'm happy to discuss further in the Q&A other variables, US role, Chinese role, et cetera, that are important. But in the interest of time and in particular, the interest of hearing from my fellow panelists, I'll turn it back over to you.
Thank you, Toby. Thank you for these, I think, interesting remarks. Our next speaker is Air Vice Marshal Shehzad Chaudhry, who retired from Pakistan Air Force in 2006. He has since then served as High Commissioner to Sri Lanka and has also taught at the Quaid-e-Azam University, Islamabad. He has been a member of various track twos on strategic security and nuclear issues, and is a frequent contributor to the national discourse on current issues in the media. He appears frequently on international media and is a regular columnist in Pakistan's mainstream papers for the last 11 years. He is a keen India watcher and comments on India-Pakistan affairs regularly. Besides what he would want to say, I would also like him to say something about these two specific issues or the questions. One, how serious is the current crisis and will it lead to another military conflict between the two nuclear armed neighbors? And what would be the role of the international community in preventing or diffusing the next crisis, especially when it is embroiled in dealing with the pandemic? And does warmongering and hostile rhetoric make any sense in the current peculiar environment? Over to you, sir.
Thank you, Adil, and thank you, CASS. Are you getting my slides or not yet?
Not yet, sir. Yes.
I think I
yes,
need
sir.
to.
Yeah.
Not yet?
We have it now.
We have it, but we don't have a full display, sir. If you can just press that F5 function. And
yeah, I've done that, but anyway, all right. Let me get along with this. Thank you very much, Adil. Thanks a lot, CASS. Happy to be a part of your panel. Obviously, the issues that have been given to me are reflected right on the screen here. What is India up to? Where might it lead us to? And what is the role of international community? So the first thing to do is to look at, all right. Yeah. What is India up to? Well, the first 3 points actually indicate to you, or it indicate to us that the first 3 things that Narendra Modi did after he came into power last year was the revocation of the Article 370 and the converting or turning Babri Mosque into a temple. And then Uniform Civil Code was what he wanted to do, but he got a part of it only when he actually legislated the triple talaq as illegal, but the rest of it obviously he couldn't go through. But he got that through through other means, and which was the Citizens Amendment Act, the National Register for Citizens, and then criminalizing the Muslims. So basically, he alienated the Muslims in his own country. He wanted them to bring about a proof of whether they've been a part of India for long, and et cetera, et cetera. So he had a list of actions to do, which he obviously managed to do with the support of the various institutions within the Indian structure. And so this is what we have been looking at. Now, within Kashmir, what India did was, obviously, he enjoys unchecked impunity because of the fact that we know that so much of oppression and suppression has gone about in the poor Kashmiris or on the poor Kashmiris. Almost 100,000 lost their lives in the last about 30 years or so. But more importantly, ever since August 5, there is absolutely no communication or very little communication coming out of Kashmir into the rest of the world. It's recently started, but that has kept Kashmir in dark. And what has happened is about 8,000 to 13,000, I think, youth have been taken away somewhere or into hiding. Nobody knows where they've gone lost. So I think that is the kind of oppression or suppression going on. Kashmir. It also went into a near war with Pakistan. And while Toby said that this was something which was perhaps for the consumption of the political or the domestic audiences, I have a different opinion of it. And this near war with Pakistan in February last year, 2019, when the two sides got into an aerial skirmish, I think more was meant for India to sort of scare Pakistan into submission. It was like enhancing the perimeter of security for India because it knew what it was doing. It was going to follow that on 5th of August with its Article 3, the revocation of the Article 370. So there was a plan in that, all that madness. It wasn't really simple madness or appeasing the public opinion within your domestic audiences. I think what else has happened in Kashmir of even greater significance is the Article 35A, supplanted, of course, now by the J&K Reorganization Act of 2019. What it does is, it obviously, it gives the power to the Indian state now to decide who is a Kashmiri, who can be declared a Kashmiri. Obviously, they have a set of rules for it as well, but they are far more flexible and relaxed than what the state of Jammu and Kashmir had in its Article 35A. Now that actually opens up Kashmir to a lot of investment, to people coming in and buying properties and lands, etc. And when you put it all together, it is basically what the demographic engineering is all about. You look at the partners in crime who've been abetting all this is, of course, the Supreme Court kept quiet on Article 370, is still very quiet on 370. It's meant to bring it up. It's never bringing it up. On the Ayodhya thing or the Babri Mosque thing, it went into and declared something which was already sort of decided or wasn't decided, wasn't declared under earlier governments. And 75 to 80% India's domestic, I think, majority supports this, because you find that the Article 370 not only passed the Lok Sabha, it also passed the Rajya Sabha, the upper house, which obviously did not have the BJP majority. So somebody else, seemingly Congress, also was not hesitant to support India's position as far as Article 370 was concerned. So I look at all this, and other than a fringe social part of the Indian society, there isn't much of a appetite to actually reverse or revert back to what the Article 370 had given to the world at large and to the Kashmiris in particular. The international community has kept quiet about it. Obviously, Toby mentioned that, and I agree with him, and I actually reinforce and reiterate the point that it emboldens Modi to do more. It emboldens Amit Shah to do more, and the Aditya Nath, etc., in India. When that happens, you don't know what the next step of Mr. Modi will be. He has a couple of considerations before he goes there, but for the moment, BJP's Hindutva and Kashmir agenda rages unabated, which is obviously a sign of discomfort for Pakistan. Hindutva is something for them to look at internally, but that reflects very much onto how things are happening in Kashmir as well. What might it lead to? There are two internal reactions. One is a social pushback within India. Obviously, we've seen that university students came out in support of some Muslims. The Muslims began to make a little bit of a noise, but now that has been closed or shut down by the COVID. Can the Muslims resurrect their dignity? Well, it is for the Muslims of India to decide and determine that, but that is a possibility when things get a little better. Pushback in Kashmir is, in my judgment, something that is bound to happen, simply because of the fact that for the moment you can close the Kashmiri leadership and other people down, and you can make some 13,000 youth disappear. But that is something that is inbuilt into the system, and I don't think the reaction to that will be mute in terms of the ethnic cleansing and genocide and whatever Indian state is now applying in there. Can the two conflate ever? And not in terms of a single control or something, but in terms of a synergy in effect when the two sides, Indian state may be divided in terms of how it is oppressing both the Muslims as well as the Kashmiris. What can be India's resort when such a thing happens? Well, we've seen one, diversionary tactics, chants of terror with convenient false flag events, and false flag events actually is meant to reinforce the chants of terror that you've heard from the Indian statements and leadership statements. Balakot-like enactments. This is to reinforce perceptions in the international audiences, to say that there are terror camps which have been taken on by the Indian forces. Surgical strikes are exactly the same extension. And then you have LOC violations, which are meant to continue to highlight the fact that there is an intent to infiltrate, despite the fact that everything is fenced down, or most of it is fenced, and obviously the Indian military and paramilitary exists in very large numbers on the other side. The second possibility is a battle of reverse front. In fact, it's already happening. And when I say battle of reverse front, and although the term is from the First World War, but what it really means is that you have battle taking place in your rear. And you have two bases that India enjoys in Afghanistan as well as Iran. From there, then it launches the kind of a battle on Pakistan, which obviously we've seen as a battle of reverse front in terms of the terror attacks that continue from there, and insurgency that is meant to, in fact, take shape in the western parts of Pakistan. These two are happening simultaneously. The world hasn't reacted much to it. The third is the offensive defense. I give it a military term simply because of the fact that we need to understand this. Offensive defense is more like Balakot, basically enhancing the perimeter of security. When India feels a bit unnerved because of the fact that there could be reaction within Kashmir, there could be reaction or support from outside Kashmir to the state in Kashmir or to the status in Kashmir, that is when India may like to go a bit on the offensive, essentially to make sure that it can, like I said, scare the people outside or the Kashmiris down and into quiet. So that is what they intend to do. Those sort of things, which can be pinprick attacks, again, the surgical strikes, as well as Balakot-like missions, could possibly be a part of it. Now, once when Pakistan responds to it, then it becomes sort of a action-reaction sequence. And then there is that possibility of escalation or dominating the escalation ladder. That obviously can lead us to some very unnerving states and situations, and that's very much a possibility. But it depends really on the first two. If there is on the first two, as India continues to apply the diversionary tactics and the battle of reverse front, and there is no reaction from Pakistan onto any of this, then it may not choose to go on to the next two, offensive defense that I said. And of course, the final is the defensive offense, something that again Toby mentioned in terms of Gilgit-Baltistan or the Azad Jammu Kashmir, for example. Something. Remember, there are three directions that India can launch towards out of Jammu and Kashmir: north, east, and south. South and east continue to remain active for a long time, and it is the north that Pakistan must pay attention to. What are the international forces likely to do? Well, if Balakot, etc. type of things happen, we've seen there was immediately an interaction by the US with both India and Pakistan and trying to keep things quiet a little bit. So that's sort of a response in case we go beyond the first two and go into something which is called the offensive defense, which India might resort to in that case. So if that happens, then obviously we can imagine two nuclear forces or a threat of two nuclear forces coming into confrontation with each other, and the world will be unnerved or disturbed about it. Now, geopolitical and geographical spread of events may entail different responses. What I really mean by this is, for example, it may not, whatever India might do in terms of an audacious offensive, something that Toby mentioned to in terms of the Gilgit-Baltistan or something like that, or Azad Jammu Kashmir. But along with that, something happens in South China Sea. Now that might, sort of keep China divided into what is happening on its absolute southwestern borders and the southeastern front. Now, if that happens, there could be a possibility of a very, very tenuous or a tentative kind of a situation where things can go out of control. That at that point of time, I feel China coming into play there. Keep in mind another thing, that when India gets into some difficulty or wants to act assertive with China, they never do it in the western sector, which is Ladakh and Tibet and Ladakh and China. Never do it from there. Always it is the Himachal and the northeastern. They don't want the Chinese to actually focus this side at all in terms of the southwestern area. So I think the Chinese would be disturbed about if things begin to get a bit close for their comfort. Under COVID-19, just to apprise ourselves, and we know this, the US has vetoed the UNSC attempt at halting conflicts. The United States did that. And along with that, the Indo-PACOM launched an operation in Venezuela. So that is as far as your question on COVID-19 is concerned, whether there should be or we can be conflict under COVID-19. It should or not is a different matter, but it has happened. There has been operation launched in Venezuela. Yemen continues in and out. Kashmir, of course, continues to bleed. And like I said, China remains the X factor in this equation. So really, we'll have to see how things develop, how things evolve. It shall also be seen as to what sort of a check can be exercised on Mr. Narendra Modi and India to keep him in check and control. Otherwise, like I said, everything is possible. There is a list of or a menu of 4 possibilities. India could possibly choose 2 or 3. 2 are already happening. The third is its choice, and you want to escalate to number 4. It's a possibility, but then we get into a full-blown war. Thank you.
Sir, thank you very much. If you could kindly press your escape button so that you can have back.
No, I just got to do this. Stop share. Yeah.
Thank you very much, sir. Thank you. Thank you for sticking to your time also, sir. Thank you very much for that. Now, our third speaker is Dr. Rabia Akhtar. She's a Director, Center for Security, Strategy and Policy Research, University of Lahore. She's also Director, School of Integrated Social Sciences at the same university. She holds a PhD in Security Studies from Kansas University and did a Master's in International Relations from Qaid-e-Azam University, Islamabad, and Master's in Political Science from Eastern Illinois University, USA. She has written extensively on South Asian nuclear security and deterrence dynamics. She is the author of the book titled The Blind Eye, US Non-Proliferation Policy Towards Pakistan and From Ford to Clinton. It's a fascinating historical account of Pakistan's nuclear program. It's a must read also. Dr. Akhtar is also the editor of Pakistan Politico, Pakistan's first strategic and foreign affairs magazine. She is also a member of Prime Minister's Advisory Council on Foreign Affairs. Dr. Akhtar is a non-resident senior fellow at the South Asia Center, Atlantic Council, Washington, DC. Dr. Akhtar, over to you. Can you unmute your mic, please?
Yeah.
Thank you.
Thank you so much, Adil, for the invitation to join this esteemed panel. And, you know, it's a great pleasure to be here. Also, I would like to thank President CASS for holding this, you know, session on a very important subject. I will start with what bothers me, and it's the term the new normal, which is flaunted around. I'll state at the outset that I do not believe in this term. And to me, everything that is happening now is a continuation of events that have manifested in previous decades. So to me, there are no transitions, no clear-cut breaks. There was no post-Second World War world. There was no post-Cold War world. There will be no post-COVID world. And there is no new normal. It has become sort of fashionable to talk about Pakistan as if it is an abnormal state, and somehow everything related to Pakistan needs to be normalized. Toby would know, and he's said that normal is a loaded term because he wrote this book about Pakistan and normal nuclear Pakistan. There have been others who have written about it. Just like that, Indian abortive surgical strikes are to somehow magically create a new normal where India has found space to punish Pakistan. I don't believe in that. What we have at our hands is India experimenting, and we all can see how that is going. So there you have it. All I see is gradual dilution of the grand Indian strategic restraint, pushing the limits to challenge Pakistan's red lines and provoke a response. The phantom surgical strikes post-Uri, the Balakot strikes earlier last year, and provocations about gaining jurisdiction over AJK as per the recent statements made by the defense minister and later the Minister of External Affairs are all indicators of India finally shedding its strategic pacifism. It is also increasingly becoming a revisionist state, finally shedding the impressions of a status quo power. So there I have my piece about the new normal. Coming to the questions that you've posed, does warmongering and hostile rhetoric make any sense in the current peculiar pandemic environment? It is such an innocent question, Adil. Kashmiris are still under brutal detention and duress after more than 288 days today in IOJK. Has the pandemic brought any relief in the curfew? Has the pandemic made the Indian government think about lifting the curfew to provide humanitarian relief to the Kashmiris? The answer is a resounding no. Then why do we even think that warmongering and hostile rhetoric should be dished by the Indian government just because we are gripped by the pandemic, irrespective of how unprecedented it is? Line of control has been on fire since August 5th and will continue to be so in the unforeseeable future. Consider this. We are still at some considerable distance from each other across the line of control. The pandemic didn't even stop the Indians from entering into a fist fight and not sticking with the Chinese border patrol team. COVID-19, social distancing, hello, stay on your side of the border. Nothing of that sort when militaries are concerned. Does the diversionary thesis of war apply here, even as the world is facing this pandemic? Yes. As of today, there have been more than 3,000 deaths from COVID-19 in India. But it did stop their former army chief and union minister V.K. Singh from making that statement that India's plan to take GB is ready? No, it did not. It is not too far-fetched a thought that while Pakistan is dealing with COVID-19 crisis, India might consider mimicking what China did to India in 1962, destroy Pakistan's post across the line of control. I don't think that they have a plan to take GB or AGK all at once. They might have a plan of destroying Pakistan's post across the line of control, capture some part of its territory across the line of control, and then do a unilateral ceasefire just short of Pakistan exploring its retaliatory options. What would Pakistan settle with giving up those posts, or would it escalate and not settle with India seizing its territory across the line of control? The fear of escalation at the line of control is real, pandemic or no pandemic. Literature on Indo-Pak limited war options and every game or simulation exercise you, I, or everybody else in this forum has attended would tell you that limited war might not remain limited. Pandemic or no pandemic again. Pakistan needs to be ready and not think even for a split second that India will spare Pakistan just because it believes Pakistan needs to direct all its energies towards dealing with the pandemic. That would be foolish. Coming on to your second question about the rising influence of Hindutva at the senior decision-making level, and is there any space for dialogue under this environment between India and Pakistan? The Hindutva ideology to me is exclusionary in its approach and discriminatory in nature. It aims to restore Hindu pride, projects Hindu nationalism, and is fascist in spirit. On behalf of the entire Indian nation, RSS driven by the Hindutva ideology gets to decide who belongs in India and who does not. So to answer your question, in view of the rising influence of Hindutva at the senior decision-making level, is there any space for dialogue? No, I do not see any space. And not because Pakistan does not want to talk, but because they don't think it worthy of their time to engage Pakistan. They are done talking to Pakistan. They don't want to engage. They want Pakistan to accept the decision of August 5th. They want Pakistan to internalize this change of status that has been unconstitutionally, illegally imposed on the people of Jammu and Kashmir, whereby the already occupied territory was annexed on August 5th to make part of Indian Union territory. They don't want to talk to you. They have acted on their manifesto. They have done what they said that they will do. And do you think that they will give Pakistan the time or day to talk, and talk about what? To them, Kashmir issue has been resolved. If now you seek talks, it means that you have accepted the current status quo of Jammu and Kashmir, because from here onwards, only this could be the new barometer. Is that acceptable to Pakistan? That is the question. Coming to your last question, with India's claims of surgical strikes being the new normal, Pakistan's policy of quid pro quo plus, what would be the nature of potential future crisis? And your second part of it, will surgical strike change the domestic Indian reality? Adil, I see QPQ, I'll call it QPQ plus, as a manifestation of Pakistan's full spectrum deterrence. QPQ plus does and will not imply that Pakistan would escalate disproportionately. The burden of escalation will remain on India, and I believe so. The pattern will be determined by the targets and territories that India opts to engage with military force upfront in the crisis. Now, having said that, the window for conventional conflict at operational and tactical levels will always exist, and India will continue to exploit it to achieve its doctrinal objectives. The preparation of Pakistan military at operational and tactical levels will thus determine how quickly this window is shut and strategic deterrence remains intact. In a crisis, previous statements by Indian leaders about NFU, AGK, GB, all are going to play on the minds of Pakistani decision makers. But I'm a bit optimistic here. In the next crisis between India and Pakistan, how both states will be able to effectively and strategically manipulate the risk of nuclear war by arranging threats and exhibiting greater levels of resolve will clearly determine the outcome of the crisis. And given the high stakes and the commitment traps involved, it may not be difficult to manipulate those risks of nuclear dangers. To quote Robert Jarvis, even a slight chance that a provocation could lead to a nuclear war is sufficient to deter all but the most highly motivated adversaries. Moreover, the balance of resolve, I believe, induces caution in the sense that each side believes that if restraint is not matched by restraint, the other side has no reason to maintain such a policy. So while there are concerns that both India and Pakistan can feel confident in playing rounds of escalation safely, the fear that either side may escalate is a deterrent in itself for any further escalation. As for your last part, which deals with whether Indian domestic reality will change post Balakot 2.0 or 3.0, let me say that it will not. India needs to understand that the nature of insurgency in Kashmir has changed since the time it began. And in order for that to happen, one would need to know the difference between the symbolic Kashmir and the strategic Kashmir. From the 1990s onward until the death of Burhan Wani in 2016, the symbolic Kashmir and the strategic Kashmir remained two separate entities. And as P.R. Chari et al. Wrote, the symbolic Kashmir is a place where larger national, subnational identities are ranked against each other. The conflict in this Kashmir is as much a clash between identities, imagination, and history as it is a conflict over territory, resources, and people. And in the strategic Kashmir, the military establishments on both sides of the border insist that Kashmir is critical to the physical defense of their respective countries. Death of Burhan Wani, to me, blurred the lines between the two Kashmirs. Born during the height of the insurgency in 1994, Wani was instrumental in turning a fading quest for independence into a Kashmiri intifada through the use of modern means of communication. And his death, to me, catapulted the resistance to another level, one that is dynamic, strong, and indigenous. Even Pakistan, and please listen to this carefully, even Pakistan perhaps is not yet cognizant of this transformation taking place, that in years to come, this indigenized struggle, which feeds on the hatred of all things Indian, fueled by the current RSS, BJP, Hindutva nexus, will not require Pakistan's support, material or moral. The symbolic and strategic Kashmir are heading for a clash, which will shape Indo-Pak nuclear rivalry if these dynamics are not understood. So will Indian domestic reality change with another crisis with Pakistan? No. Why? Remember that this generation is in for a rude awakening, and it is coming whether anyone likes it or not, whereby sab yaad rakha jayega, sab yaad rakha jayega. So I'll end here and looking forward to the Q&A.
Great. Thank you, Dr. Rabia. As always, very fascinating points that you made. Now we move to discussion session, but just again, some administrative announcements. There's a section for chat on your screens for all the participants, and also for question answers. So anybody who wishes to ask a question, he or she can write a question, and the panelists, they have the option of responding directly by chatting, not speaking over here. But whatever, I'll expect that whatever questions comes through moderator, that I expect the panelists would be responding. So you have the option of responding directly also to some of the observations, because in the end, we may not be able to cover all the questions. So I have a couple of questions, but looking at the growing list of these questions, let me give the chance first to the participants. First question from Tarek Rauf from Vienna. He has asked a question, I think it's intended for ABM Shehzad Chaudhry. How does, although he did mention my name also, but I'll not respond and let ABM Shehzad Chaudhry to respond to, how does Pakistan envisage the future air-land battle scenario in the future in the Kashmir theater of operations? That is greater reliance on BVR missiles in aerial combat, air-to-ground missiles, air-to-air-ground, whatever, all these options, and how to address controlling escalation, dominance, and crisis stability. And why were 50-year-old Mirages deployed for the attack on Balakot? I think that's a technical issue. We can leave this now. Yeah. But first part of the question, if you can address that.
Yeah, I mean, air-land battle or whatever kind of battle you call it, simply whenever a nation has to go to armed resort, it will have to take on whatever is its capacity or capability. So it isn't really about a particular model of an air-land battle, which is something from the 1980s or 70s that we can revert to, but no more. I think you will have to choose whatever is the best or the most optimal weapon of choice for that kind of an employment, for that kind of a mission. You saw from surgical strikes, Indians went on to the Indian Air Force into Balakot, and then sort of regressed from there as well. Like someone said, for the last 15 months, there hasn't been any follow-up. So understandably, because of the fact that there was a response the very next day by the Pakistani Air Force, again, choosing or selecting what was most optimal for it to employ in that sense. And when you take on a mission, you use all the elements of a particular mission to bring that mission to a success. So regardless of the nomenclature, I think I hope we don't get there. I hope we don't get there, but if we need to, we will obviously fall back on what we have.
So thank you very much. Next question by Ms. Samara Durrani, and she agrees with Toby's assessments of this regional dynamics, but she says what she finds missing from his submissions and she's asking for in his reading is whether and how Washington is currently viewing with concern or not the regional situation at our end. And secondly, what would be the Washington's likely response in case one or both of our countries decide to be unwise and escalate to unexpected levels? Toby, your turn, please.
It's a very good question. I wish I had a very good answer for this question. My sense is that the political establishment in Washington is alternately fixated on COVID and the upcoming election, and has very little time for foreign affairs issues, unless it has to do with blaming China for the COVID situation. So even things that ought to gather more attention, the situation in Iran, with Iran, for instance, I think is a good one where there's a potential for U.S. direct military engagement there. I think the bandwidth here, political process, attention span, et cetera, just isn't there. So I doubt that this issue gets much attention in the White House. There's a dearth of senior political officials who are really kind of looking abroad. In terms of how the U.S. might engage in a next crisis, I think you look back at 2016 and then in 2019, and on the one hand, there was, I think, because of the compunction of the building of U.S.-India strategic partnership, there was some sense that the U.S. needed to support India's feeling of injustice at having suffered these attacks, and to recognize that India was within its right to respond in some way, while also trying to navigate not encouraging Indian actions that would escalate further. And I know that that was handled mainly by private phone calls in 2016. In 2019, you did see some US statements that were a little bit, I'd say, unhelpful in terms of understanding of the Indian airstrike at Balakot. My guess is that when the next one comes around, kind of in light of somewhat improved US-Pakistan relations, assuming that condition prevails, the US will return to a more balanced approach of encouraging calm and trying to find ways to help both countries to de-escalate. Whether that will be accepted by both countries or not is an open question, right? I think the US influence on this issue is somewhat declining. That would be my guess. So I realize that's, like I said, an unsatisfactory answer to a good question, but it's my best guess.
Thank you, Toby. So what I'll try in the interest of maintaining this balance, I'll bring out a question by Naseem Abbas, probably he's from Karachi. So it's a question for I'll request Dr. Rabia to answer this. While we know the volatility of the situation between two nuclear rivals and chances of an uncontrollable escalation in any military adventurism by India in the future, why, in your opinion, is the international community so indifferent to the solution of Kashmir as per UN resolutions? I think it's kind of generic, but Dr. Rabia, if you could kindly respond to this.
Sure. So our Prime Minister, went to the UN, and the kind of flashpoint of his talk post August 5th in the UN session was to divert world attention to this conflict of Kashmir. And why so? Because, after having suffered all these crises between India and Pakistan, and that have been resolved with the help of third party only, the world needs to pay more attention. Because if India and Pakistan are left to their own devices, in the absence of bilateral crisis management mechanisms, you don't know as to how long it's going to go, where it's going to end up. So that is why he wanted the world community to be involved and do something about it, and find a resolution of Kashmir. Why is the international community not bothered? Is because it is not in their there is no convergence of national interest here with respect to what US has at stake in the region. There are better things that it has to deal with, which involves getting out of Afghanistan at the moment and using India to balance off China. And given that the nature of this conflict, India has maintained that it is a bilateral conflict, and it does not want any third party to be involved. I don't think US can come out with a heavy hand towards India and force it towards a resolution. There is total convergence of national interest between US and India, and anything on Kashmir, which is provocative and making India change its course on Kashmir, is going to hamper a US national interest, on the other hand, for which it needs India. So I believe, in short, to answer your question, the world will remain indifferent. And I think it will be, at the end of the day, for India and Pakistan to find a resolution of this. And as we move towards that, in order to avoid future crises, we need to develop bilateral crisis management mechanisms so that our reliance and dependence on third parties is reduced. Thank you.
Thank you, and thank you to the panelists for concise responses, and this can afford us more opportunity to include more questions. The next question I'll take from our Senior Research Associate, Ms. Sitara Nu. It's to the panelists. Traditionally, the United States and China have had a shared objective of diffusing India-Pakistan crisis. However, unlike any previous crisis, China played a more pronounced role during Pulwama Balakot crisis. That's her opinion. So would that role be retained? If so, how would US reconcile with this additional third party? Could this potentially add a new troubling dimension, that is US versus Pakistan, to the India-Pakistan crisis? While you can ponder on this question, Toby, let me also flag this question by Marshal Ishfaq. And you can think of and you can respond after the panelists have responded to Ms. Sitara's question. This is about, you mentioned about this term Indian reaction to Pakistanis alleged provocation. So he says that response can be to provocative acts from Pakistan, not from any acts of militancy in India by the Kashmiri freedom fighters or in response to BJP government's suppressive policies against minorities. So in past, India has failed to prove Pakistan's involvement in many acts of terrorism. So according to his view, provocation would not only be necessary for Modi to initiate a military action to divert domestic public attention away from his failures. So it could be larger than this. You can think of, and what we can do is we can start from AVM Shahzad to respond to the first question that I raised. And if Dr. Rabia can respond, and Toby, then you can take both the questions.
Yeah, let me just answer the question that you posed in terms of China's support to Pakistan during the Balakot and subsequent skirmish. Surely, China has stood by Pakistan, and we know that for a long, long time now. Whether China will extend that kind of a support beyond the diplomatic and political levels to, let's say, an active support to Pakistan under any kind of a difficult situation, I think we'll also have to relate to how much China feels threatened in terms of its own interests. What are the Chinese interests which could be at stake, for example, as far as Pakistan and India are concerned? The very recent CPEC, for example, is something that China values very much. It is a part of its strategic plan to net the areas of influence, and therefore that is very much there in terms of how Pakistan and China are. So if anything, that sort of impacts Gilgit-Baltistan or sort of moves into that direction, or for that matter, even AJK, I find that China will be unable to sort of stand by and just issue diplomatic and political statements. In terms of Washington being a silent partner for a very long time, and we've known this, that whenever India and Pakistan have gone into a difficulty, the US has been the first country, or perhaps the main country, to sort of come in and resolve issues or keep the temperatures down in South Asia. Whether that will stay on for a long time also depends upon American interest. If the American interest, and I see that, for example, not in terms of weakening Pakistan as we mostly perceive, it's not a zero-sum game, but in terms of how China can be weakened. Let's say, how does South China Sea play out in this? Now, if that is becoming a factor, then I find that the US might have tilted its balance of support towards India. Otherwise, I think the United States' main intent and focus will continue to keep the two nuclear powers in some sort of a check. So I find that both these major powers, China and the US, will have some sort of a role if things go beyond simply the first two stages that I mentioned of the four that are possible.
Dr. Abia?
So to answer Sitara's question, I've written about India and Pakistan outsourcing escalation control to these major powers, namely, United States and China. But during Balakot crisis, we have seen that there are new players on the scene. There was the Kingdom of Saudi Arabia, there was UAE, there was OIC as a voice talking to both India and Pakistan. So what I see is reduced dependency on United States as a primary actor. Adem Shahzad Chaudhry has rightly mentioned, and there's no need to repeat it, that China has strategic interest in Pakistan. And if Pakistan goes to war with India, those interests are hampered. And it will not be able to achieve its economic objectives via Pakistan. So it would be in Chinese interest to jump in, and even if it's back channel, even if it is not too proactive and does not come forward, it would want Pakistan to be restrained. It would want India to be restrained in its response and approaches, simply because its interests are going to be at stake. So as long as Chinese interests remain at stake, and Pakistan realizes that, and India realizes that, and China keeps on making both these countries realize that, I think China will be invested in finding a solution, or toning down a crisis. Thanks.
Toby?
To Sitara's question on China, I have to say that this is a puzzle that many in Washington have wrestled with to try to understand China's orientation to the potential for future crisis that somehow threatens its interests. It's, a singular data point in Balakot does not suggest a change or a trend. It's just, I think, a singular data point, and we need to recognize that. Most people who think about this issue here, which is a relatively small community, I think believe that as China's economic investments in both countries grow, it has more liabilities in both countries that would encourage it to be more overt in its efforts to dampen crises. But that also militates against the kind of Chinese mantra of not interfering in internal affairs of other countries, or even bilateral affairs of other countries. And so there's real tension there. Part of that puzzle for us also has to do with who is making the policies in China. And it's, in speaking with Chinese colleagues in various think tanks and universities, it's not entirely clear how the policy process in Beijing kind of deals with interests related to CPEC on the one hand, China-India relations on the other. In terms of how the US would view a Chinese role there, I think at some level, it's it should be welcome that China would do more to restrain potential crisis. There's another issue that I would just flag about how the U.S. view might change over time, which is that I think you can already see in the U.S. a trend of insularity, of turning inwards politically. A lot of that is manifest in support for Trump's kind of anti-immigration rhetoric and policies. There's been establishments of think tanks to encourage U.S. to not engage so much in foreign wars and so forth. And I think the pandemic will reinforce that trend. And so if that continues, then does that suggest that the U.S. would be quote unquote outsourcing more of the crisis role that it played previously? I sort of asked that as a question. I don't have an answer, but I can imagine that could be the case. On the question from Air Vice Marshal Ashfaq about kind of provocations that India might use and the kind of attribution of those to Pakistan. I'm not a scholar of sort of different groups in Pakistan and how they have engaged in Kashmir or not. Obviously, there is indigenous insurgency in Kashmir. The extent of external support for that at this point, is not something that I'm familiar with. I would note Rabia's point about the kind of evolving or the conjoining of the symbolic and the strategic Kashmir at this point. I think that I'm sort of puzzling through this in my own mind as I talk, which is a dangerous territory to get into here. But I think that the weight of international opinion at this point favors not so much what India is doing in Kashmir, but is given the pattern of past attacks in India having been attributed to groups based in Pakistan, that kind of favors a tendency to believe if India attributes something to Pakistan. And so that, to go back to the other question though, about whether that will embolden Modi to do something more or not, I don't know. My inclination is to be wary of that leap in logic. But, like I said, I'm 11,000 kilometers away, and I can imagine that people just across the border would feel differently. So I realize that the attribution of and kind of calling things provocation is problematic, that India might do things for domestic political reasons, that the kind of domestic rise of insurgency, India might seek to blame on Pakistan when it's not there. Those all may be the case, and attribution will be increasingly difficult. But at some level, at least in terms of the international view, I'm not sure it's as important as you might think.
Thank you, Toby.
Yeah.
Sir, if it is very important, because we have 25 questions in the question answer box,
okay.
and equally now good number of comments in the chat box. Yeah. What I'm going to do is next because I believe Toby has to leave at 5:15 Pakistan Standard Time. If you can stay, we'll be very happy to have you here, but feel free if you have to go. So what I'm going to do is raise 3 questions by different participants to different panelists, and request them to respond. First, by Mr. Abdul Basit, how the expected US exit from Afghanistan will affect India-Pakistan adversarial relations, particularly when the US wants India to play a greater role in Afghanistan. He is also referring to Zalmay Khalilzad's recent visit to New Delhi, and also the recent statement made by Stanak Zaid about India's involvement or the terrorist act in Afghanistan. So that's a quite strong statement that was made. So that's one question. One of the panelists can take, maybe Toby, if you can take this one. And the other question from Ambassador Jalil Abbas Jalani, who is our colleague, worthy colleague. He talked about US involvement in this region and de-escalation of the crisis between India and Pakistan in the past from 2003 and 2007 peace process. And we all know that. So his question is, do you think the US will at some stage consider playing the same role, which would also entail persuading India to reverse its 5th August action and revive the dialogue process disrupted in 2007? He has asked Toby, but Toby can respond, but I'll also request Dr. Rabia to respond to this, because the third question I'm directing to AVM Shahzad Chaudhry by Dr. Salma Malik. And her question is, what will Pakistan's response scenario be in the context of whatever you said? Will we remain reactive only? There exists a genuine fear and confusion amongst the people of Gilgit-Baltistan and Azad Jammu and Kashmir about the developments across the line of control and India's cartographic claims and changes. So if you want to comment on this, ABM Shahzad sir, and Toby, you can pick both the questions or just respond to the Afghanistan, and Dr. Rabia to Ambassador Jilani's question. We can start with Toby if you're ready. So you can go ahead on Afghanistan.
Actually, if it's okay, could I defer? I want to read the other question too, which I haven't had a chance to do yet. So
sure, any of the panelists can start. So, Dr. Rabia, do you mind taking this question?
Yeah, I'll be brief, because I think part of this question about US involvement has been answered in different stages by different panelists, and Toby has extensively covered it as to what are the reasons as to why US will be more inward looking as we move forward, given their election, given their leadership, and all that. So with respect to whether US will push India to reverse this 5th August decision, I don't see that happening. What would be the basis for India to listen to the US when India has maintained a narrative which has been bought across the board by international community that it is its internal matter. And a lot of, you need to also keep in mind that a lot of time has passed since August 5th. So if there was to be any momentum to be generated on this, any country that needed to be brought in to put pressure on India, the time was right after August 5th and months, beyond that. With the COVID-19 situation post-pandemic, and as to how now, China is in the mix of it and US trying to, find an scapegoat, it all the more raises the profile of India in the region. And I don't think that US is now going to, damage that profile by going back to the Kashmir issue, which to it probably is redundant already. Thank you.
AVM Shahzad sir.
There was a reference made, I think, in one of the questions. I don't know who asked that question, but there was a reference made to the 2003 and 2007 sort of interventions by the United States. And I think Rabia just mentioned that, answered part of that question, in the sense that what happens in the US in the coming months and years is going to be more important and critical to how the world settles down. Either they will cede space, which they, in my judgment, as they abdicate their international position, they are possibly already doing that to other forces, and notably China. Now, if that be the case, then obviously, and if that is the way forward as far as the US is concerned, something that is going on as a debate within the US as to what the US must do, and whether President Trump returns or doesn't return in November. So that's going to decide as to how the world, but the world will have to come to some sort of a concurrence on how to coexist. It just cannot be left to itself in terms of fragmentation or division in terms of either the economic order or the political order. I think that will have to be put into place if the one that is currently holding somehow begins to get fragmented a little bit. But coming to the second question that you specifically posed to me, in terms of Dr. Salma Malik's question, what should Pakistan do? What should be Pakistan's response? I think more importantly, Pakistan has to look at the fact that what are its interests. Ironically, Pakistan used to be a revisionist force, if not a power, in the region. India used to be a status quo sort of force. The roles have reversed considerably. And we look at going back to the status quo, anti-August 5. And when that happens, you're looking at very specific objectives. You may not be looking at sort of moving into Delhi and to the Red Fort as has been stated, for numerous number of years now. But the fact is that you need to look at some particular aspects of how the two countries learn to coexist. And in that, we need to find ways and modicums of how to sort or resolve our issues. That is going to decide more importantly. And what that really means, what that means is we are unwilling or we will not lose any part, an inch of what we have, but we are not forcing ourselves into a situation where we perhaps must do something different to disturb the status quo. So I think that is the kind of thing that Pakistan will look at. It is important for Pakistan, as I think Rabia mentioned in her presentation. Pakistan must defend in strength where it feels threatened, wherever it feels that it is going to be delayed in time, logistically, or for that matter, being able to put forces in time over there. So I think that is an area that Pakistanis need to look at. And for me, all three axes of Indian audacious or adventurous moves are very much possible. And it's good to be mindful and careful with your defenses in place, then be offensive and looking for some sort of a revision.
Toby.
Great. I think on the question of about, would the U.S. push to reverse the August 5th decision, you see more discomfort in U.S. politics with that decision than probably anything over the past decades in U.S.-India relations. There have been, efforts to have hearings on Capitol Hill, statements from some U.S. politicians against that decision. But I think it probably is now a fact on the ground. And I have a hard time imagining what the circumstances would be that the US would decide that it would try to use whatever leverage it has with India over this issue to reverse it. I think that seems unlikely, even if such leverage existed, which I'm not sure it does. I think that clearly that was a decision that has an internal logic in India that has pretty widespread support. And so I think it would be very difficult for the US to try to do something to return that, notwithstanding whether it's a just action or not. There's kind of a bigger question out there too, which is what is the future shape of US-India relations? I think after a period of convergence, I kind of see there's a little bit of drift now. I would guess that if there's a different administration in the US from January 21 next year, a Democratic administration, then there could be new emphasis on kind of building again on the US-India partnership. But one of the bases on which, at least the narrative bases on which that partnership was built, was the sort of common democracy foundation, and that's harder to do now. It's not, rhetorically, I think it carries less weight, given concerns about the kind of majoritarian politics that Modi has asserted in India. So I think there's new questions out there for me, I think, about what that partnership might look like going forward. On the US exit from Afghanistan and what will be the impact on India, Pakistan, it's a really good question. I'm not, I try to be very clear about what I'm comfortable talking about and not talking about. I'm not a scholar of Afghanistan. I have no experience there. I know that it's integral to the region. It's an integral part of India-Pakistan relations. It's just one that I'm not as familiar with personally. And so just kind of speaking off the cuff, I can imagine a couple scenarios. One, Afghanistan becomes a proxy theater of war between India and Pakistan after the US withdrawal, and so that there's blowback in both countries because of that. That would be kind of a worst case scenario. I suppose there are scenarios also where the two countries agree that a stable Afghanistan somehow better suits their interests, their mutual interests, and finding ways to stabilize the politics there so that there's less potential blowback and it dampens the potential for conflict would be good. That would be a more optimistic outcome. I think that the chance is probably way more towards the first one than the second one. And presumably there's shades in between. I don't, but like I said, I'm just kind of uncomfortable with the details of that issue to know how to better assess what the various options look like and what the probabilities for them look like.
Thank you, Toby. So since we have lots of questions, so I'm trying to bracket these questions. Again, I'll put a set of 3 questions to each one of the speakers, panelists, and they can think while the other person is responding. So this question by Karen, she is referring to Rabia's pointing out about people, Burhan Wani's generation. So her question is that the new generation is completely uncompromising, anti-bilateral dialogue, and openly saying we would rather be dead than being injured. Many have been waiting for Pakistan to go to war to rescue them, despite knowing that Kashmir might be destroyed in the process. So her question is, to what degree is this change in ideology and temperament of young Kashmiris included in assessments? And how will Pakistan deal with increased pressure by Kashmiris to act and respond with much less restraint than it has? So I'll direct this question to Dr. Rabia Akhtar. And then another question that probably I'll request Miriam Shahzad is by Ms. Amara again. Her question is that she thinks that Pakistan recognizes and now articulates well the Kashmiri struggle being an indigenous one, but the world is not buying this. In your view, why is that? What is missing in our current business case for proving originality of the struggle? And Toby, a question by Saeed Ali Zia Jafri. He was the first one to flag his question, so my apologies to him, I missed earlier. How and why do you term an attack on mainland Pakistan as calibrated, given that it represented a shift in the fundamental target and territory choices? So that's one question. So I'll just tag this question with another thing. Toby, you wrote in your recent article that you wrote for strapishare.com. You said something about that the new normal narrative suits political and military establishments in both states. So how do you justify that? How does it favors Pakistani military establishment to accept this new normal? So that's one thing that I haven't been able to understand. If you could kindly respond to that. So we start with Dr. Rabia, please.
All right, thank you so much for this extremely difficult question as to, whether there is any realization in Pakistan or, in its calculations about this new generation, change in ideology and thinking and looking towards Pakistan for some sort of a solution, even if it's war, and they know that they will be annihilated in the process if India and Pakistan actually go to a full-fledged war over Kashmir. There are no easy, comfortable answers for that question. I personally believe that, Pakistan is, for so long, Pakistan has had a position on Kashmir. With this new reality setting in, and every day that has passed for these Kashmiris under curfew, the only hope that they see, they're done with the international community. It is good that New York Times and Washington Post come out with these editorials and, storyboards saying that, Kashmir needs to be looked at as a humanitarian crisis. But what is actually being done on ground? So they hope looking towards Pakistan. And the kind of discussions that go on in Pakistan are, I think Pakistan needs to understand what its end game in Kashmir is. First, we need to have that clarity. We need to know as to what do we want. It's good for rhetorical sake to say that we want a resolution of Kashmir. But what does that even mean? What is your roadmap to get there? Do you have a roadmap? And if yes, then it needs to be implemented, because the Kashmiris under curfew and detention are looking towards you. I personally believe that there is no kinetic option. And I'm going to be provocative here. I know a lot of people are not going to like this, but Pakistan's, there is a lot of rhetoric that goes that Pakistan will go to every extent, to the last standing point to ensure that Kashmiris are liberated. And that involves the use of nuclear weapons as well. Everybody just puts, some people just put that on the table as well. But where in, Pakistan's nuclear doctrine does it say that 8 million Kashmiris are also covered by Pakistan's nuclear deterrence? We say that Pakistan's territory, which includes AJK, GB, is going to be protected. We are not going to give up an even inch of it. But where do we say that we are going to conquer or liberate those 8 million Kashmiris just because we have the weapons to do so? I do not believe that there is any kinetic option on the ground. And that is where our options are restricted. The best course has been, which is not good, is diplomacy, because it takes a lot of time. It takes a lot of time to strike at the hearts of people, showing them pictures of those pelleted faces of people in curfew during this pandemic. And still, what do you have? Inward-looking policies, because everybody is trying to survive during this pandemic. And who's thinking about the Kashmiris? So, like I said, there are no easy answers to this question. Thank you.
Maybe Shahzad, sir?
Repeat the question because age seems to be catching up and I got carried away by Rabia's answer, but go ahead, repeat the question, please.
Okay, so I'll also have to find out. Yes.
Pose another.
It's a complete long list, so it's difficult.
Okay, go ahead. Sorry for missing that out. I'm totally
So
lost.
meanwhile, Toby, if you can.
Can I tell Avim Shahzad, the question by Amara Durrani was that if it's an indigenization of Kashmir movement, why does Pakistan keep on losing its narrative on Kashmir as to why don't people?
Oh, yeah, exactly. I think Pakistan has made mistakes on Kashmir, and let's accept that fact. I think it's important to acknowledge that and accept that. Pakistan has rectified the policy, and I think for a number of years now. I think I would perhaps go back to about 2002, 2003, and suggest that Pakistani change of policy on Kashmir, which perhaps looked at some sort of an active or kinetic support in certain areas, is obviously no more. And so that is what muddied the case of the Kashmiris, and we didn't help the Kashmiris in their cause at all. But I think the way Pakistan has conducted itself over the last couple of decades, especially, I think has been quite remarkable in the fact that our support is now restricted and limited to political, diplomatic, etc. only. And we will continue to stand by them. And we will, like Rabia said, we're not going to sacrifice Pakistan for any other piece of land, surely, but we will stand by the Kashmiris in terms of what their rights are and what their what they stand for. So in that sense, Pakistan's voice will be there with the Kashmiris, and obviously both India and Pakistan need to sit together and resolve the issue. The longer India keeps with the issue, this problem of Pakistan sort of choosing one or the other option, or from a list of similar responses, like India has those 4 or 5 that I mentioned, Pakistan may also have a list of 4 or 5 options, and therefore you push a country into resorting to what perhaps suits a particular environment. So in that sense, Pakistan will play its role, but I hope and pray that a better sense prevails in Delhi. And like Pakistan has said for a long time, we can sit down, we can talk, and we can resolve issues. So I don't think that as long as Pakistan follows this particular sort of recipe, I think, as you've seen in the last year and a half, couple of years, there is now the voice of the Kashmiris being heard all over. So I don't think that it's entirely a quiet sort of scene out there in terms of the Kashmiri sensitivity or the sensitivity to the Kashmiri cause. Very much, I find that there are people now looking at Kashmiris. The UN Secretary General recently has come up with not only the state of Muslims in India, but also the looking at how the state of Kashmir is. And so therefore, there are people who are sensitive to this. Even President Trump has spoken about it in a couple of meetings that he's had both with the Pakistani and the Indian leadership. So let's hope and pray that we can sort of stay the course and keep bringing the Kashmiris back into focus and spotlight.
So Toby, before you respond to the questions that I raised, maybe that was a question by Saeed Alizia. How and why do you term an attack on mainland Pakistan as calibrated? But there's also a comment by Hasham Ahmed, who said, you also said something that it was a luck. So how do you reconcile if it is a calibrated, and then you say probably there was a luck factor also? So maybe if you can take both of these comments or questions together, and then also respond to the question that I raised, that in your paper you said, or the article you read, the new norm narrative favors military establishments on both sides. So I principally disagree on the Pakistani side. I don't think so. We agree to that, but how do you justify that?
Sure. So how is the Indian Air Force strike on Balakot calibrated? Well, presumably there were a range of options that the Indian government looked at that could be attacked, a range of vectors for those attacks. And they chose to target a facility that was not a Pakistan military facility in an unpopulated area, with the belief that it was a facility linked to the group that had claimed responsibility for the Pulwama attack. It used, I gather, 4 targeted munitions, and there's questions about what it hit, what it didn't hit, and so forth that I'll not wade into. But to me, that suggested an interest in highlighting this as a counterterrorism operation, not as a military retaliation against Pakistan, designed to demonstrate to the international community that it was choosing a target that had some justness associated with it in terms of responding to terrorism. And I would just simply point out that this calibrated option was a lot less than many other people in India were calling for. And I think that there was probably dissatisfaction, notwithstanding the kind of crowing and PR victory that this was for Prime Minister Modi. There were people in India who were calling for much more. And so I think you have to say that this was limited. You could probably make the case that it was proportional, and it wasn't something that was going to be so escalatory to somehow immediately get into a ground war or something like that. So that's why I make the case that that it was calibrated. How do I reconcile that with luck? I mean, mostly the luck part of that comes after that, right? Had they hit that facility and had there been hundreds of women and children who were killed, that would have changed the optic of it. If the Indian pilot hadn't been captured and returned, but instead had been killed on the ground, that would have changed the optics and the sort of parameters for de-escalation, I guess. And so the luck part of it was that things could have gone differently. The retaliation by the Pakistan Air Force could have inadvertently hit something. Targeted munitions don't always hit their targets. They sometimes hit other things. So just that's kind of how I can reconcile both the calibration and the role of luck in this. Adil, on your question about whether, how the new normal suits the military security establishments in both countries. I think it does so for different reasons in both sides. In Pakistan, I think that the idea of, on the one hand, you see people rejecting that there's a new normal, rejecting the Indian narrative, but then also claiming that there's a Pakistan new normal, right? That there's, now quid pro, this is the problem with not having had enough coffee before we do these in the morning, quid pro quo plus, that is the sort of the new normal, really. And so it puts this problem within a framework that largely has to do with military options, which obviously puts the interests of the military front and center. And they're the ones that, by and large, control this narrative. And it went to the extent that it justifies their interests, it also justifies spending money on weapons and so forth at a time when money could be spent on public health, which is clearly a manifest challenge for every country at this point in dealing with this pandemic. I think it's similar in India, although slightly different, which is that there for a long time, I think the Indian military has chafed a little bit at the restraint that political leaders exercised in not authorizing military actions after, for instance, the Mumbai attack in 2008. And so asserting a new normal sort of is psychologically, I think, important. And that is also, therefore, suits the interests of the Indian military to demonstrate that it is tough to go along with the tough rhetoric coming from the Indian political leadership.
Thank you, Toby. We are heading to a close. So just final 2 rounds of this question. This question about by Shazar, a young researcher at CASS, a very bright researcher. So her question is, since Indian military is now having more influence in decision making, so this notion of that military is a tool for achieving certain political objectives, how relevant would this be in the future because of the growing involvement of military, and we see the CDS becoming almost he's also kind of a political appointment now, so making political statements. So there's a shift in strategic. So her question is, how relevant would this be? And another question, which is quite off from today's discussion, but it refers to your area of expertise, Toby, about arms control disarmaments. Since international community now tends to leave India and Pakistan on their own, some people believe, so how much influence would they have in future arms control measures in terms of disarmament measure as and when it starts or resumes? So that's one question. The second is about, by Salman Ali Khan, it's about, while considering the military standoff between India and Pakistan, we have always focused on conventional military balance and have overlooked the exploitation of cyber domain. His question is, how will be Pakistan able to cope with any cyber attack launched by the Indian side, keeping in view our weak capabilities? So maybe if Ibn Shahzad wants to respond to this question, or Dr. Rabia, whoever. So Toby.
I think the potential for arms control between India and Pakistan has been there for a long time. There are fundamental challenges, obviously, in how you deal with certain kinds of asymmetries. And ultimately, whether there can be some formulation that addresses those asymmetries and is sustainable, has enough transparency and monitoring to allow both countries to have confidence that the terms of the arms control would be met. Those are huge issues. I would make a political point, which is that this is not something that can be forced from the outside, right? There were the U.S. put lots of effort in 1998 on encouraging various kinds of restraint, including having both India and Pakistan sign up to the CTBT, and to take different kinds of measures to restrain their nuclear postures and forces. And largely these were rejected because as new sort of open nuclear states, there was a lot of effort that presumably had to go into building those forces, creating the military and political infrastructure to support them, and so forth. And so, from that standpoint, just as it was not ripe at that time for the outside community to push and support arms control in South Asia, the only time where the international community can have some role is when the base conditions are ripe in South Asia, that there's an organic impetus that is shared between India and Pakistan that recognizes that some sort of détente, agreements to stabilize both not only the strategic situation, but also situations that might escalate, that has to exist. It can't be forced from the outside. And until that time, any kind of when we can come up with creative ideas, and there's been a lot that's been written in this space, a lot of creative ideas about missile regimes and so forth. And I like a lot of those ideas, but ultimately the political base of support has to be there in both countries for those ideas to work. I hope that someday that organic support is there. And when it is, then I think there will be lots of countries, international experts and so forth that are all too ready to help in any way possible to see that kind of agreement over the line.
Thank you. AVM Shahzad sir, do you want to respond to the cyber issues, cyber security? And
Okay, I'll try. I mean, this is not my field though, but let me suggest that both economies and societies are far more obviously technology dependent these days. And there used to be Warden's 5-ring model when we were studying campaign and strategies, etc., a couple of decades back, and looking at those. And the 5 rings basically led you either serially or in parallel to the most to the nerve center, which was the command and control or the leadership. And if today the leadership is so dependent on what is now entirely technology dependent and therefore open to some sort of disruption from across the border or from any adversary. So therefore, rather than go serially from the outside to inside in terms of the 5 rings, you can possibly access the inner ring or the nerve center right straight ahead and straight away without going through even a parallel. So in my judgment, unless and until adequate defenses and measures are created or sort of integrated into how parallel structures of command and control exist, you might find that the air campaign or the air war has possibly moved or graduated from being serial to parallel to now what is perhaps not even parallel, and therefore, regardless whether it is air launched or not, but a sort of a control which can reach your heart of the leadership, which is a command and control system. And if that is dependent on information and communication and a lot of data coming in, so that data becomes very, very vulnerable. So therefore, any country or any nation, which is actually most these days, need to assure that they have adequate defenses and firewalls created to ensure that not only that they have parallel structures, they also must have enough firewalls to keep any kind of this kind of. Remember, the US and China are into it perpetually. I mean, Facebook and Russia are very much a part of discussion in the US for the 2016 election. So this is very much going on in the world already. So I mean, perhaps Pakistan, I can say for Pakistan, I'm sure we are already into it and we have sufficient sort of defenses created for that. But yes, this is a problem and it obviously needs to be resorted or dealt with technology. Technology creates it, technology must resolve it.
So thank you very much. Toby, the last 2 questions, and that's related to your recent article. There's so many questions.
Sorry,
yeah,
can
please, Dr. Abia. Yeah, please.
Can I answer Shahzad's question about Indian military decision-making, its role in decision-making? So, thank you for the question. I'll be brief. Firstly, I really enjoy your writing, so please, continue to write. We just had a seminar with Praveen Sani, and one of the questions asked was about this. I would be very careful if I'm a researcher writing on these to pick up on these little things, but Indian military is still very much in control of its civilian leadership. There is just no, while they might make statements and all, they're still very much subordinate. It is a system that is still intact, and civilian political leadership is the one that is in charge of policy decision-making where all the issues strategic are concerned. So while you might see these, random statements and provocations coming out, they are not done without consultation with the civilian leadership. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Abia. Toby, last 2 questions, very brief one, related to your article. You can see how much interest your article has generated in this part of the world. And this is an incentive for you to write more on South Asian crisis with your expertise and background. This is related to, you wrote in that article that record of crises between India and Pakistan during 2002 and 2016 suggests that the Indian see conflict with Pakistan detrimental to their economic interest and global image building project. So if that is the case, why India continues to engage in developing new war fighting concepts and coming up with surgical strikes and things like that. So if it is detrimental to their image. Second, if you could kindly respond, you also wrote something about this a surgical strike inside Pakistan, allegedly killing some of the terrorists, may do more harm to Pakistan's pride. And in response, Pakistan can do probably quid pro quo plus, but the cost to India could be relatively low. So I'm asking this question. Pakistan is a relatively smaller country, with limited military potential. A smaller country, if it inflicts a punishment or humiliation to a bigger country, how will the cost would be low for India in that case? So these two questions, and then if you could respond, and we will close question and answer session, and we will request President to give his concluding remarks, and then we will wind up this webinar. Thank you.
Great. Well, thanks. And I would love to write more on these issues. These days, you know, as you all know, and you know, I don't know how Rabia is as productive as she is. I feel like she probably accomplishes more by the time I'm awake than I'll get done in the entire week. So I would like to have time to write more. So why is India developing its capabilities if you know, if these were kind of not consonant with its larger policy projects to build international prestige and so forth? And I think they are, but what's changed is the conception of what Indian interests are that has been articulated by Modi. And so Modi is, you know, a tough guy, wants to have this image of a tough guy. India as a state that is, you know, a global power, and global powers don't suffer attacks from you know, groups based in neighboring states. They respond, and that's how you be tough and how you show other countries that you mean business and that they need to take you seriously. Part of that then means that you have to have military capabilities to go with that. That's not, you know, that's not why countries develop military capabilities alone. There are lots of reasons why countries develop military capabilities having to do with, you know, vested interests from industry, from the military institutions themselves, et cetera. And so, you know, there's lots of literature out there on that. I don't think there's any inconsistency there. It's more about why do we see the change in 2016 from prior crises where there had been a decision not to respond. And I think that largely owes to the image that Modi wanted to craft for India. And that relates then to the second question about the costs to accept and to deliver some kind of you know, quid pro quo plus. You know, I think India is a large country, a populated country, a largely populated country. You know, and a I can't say it at all this morning.
Quid pro quo
plus, thank you, attack. You know, again, depending on the targets and so forth, you know, maybe it kills, you know, some number of civilians or military forces. You know, that in kind of grand population terms, and this sounds cavalier to say, but I think, you know, that's not like it's lots of people to suffer the damage from it. The bigger issue, though, is if you look at how the Indian political establishment spun the Balakot attack as a victory, and then sustained that narrative through various forms of media during that and after that crisis. I think it shows you that even if India were to suffer some, you know, quid pro quo plus attack, it almost doesn't matter what the damage is, right? It will spin that as victory, and it's shown an amazing ability to control that narrative domestically. And so, you know, I think at that point it will be up. It's not the damage itself that really is important. It's whether somehow the challenge, you know, it's not the cost. It's the political challenge, and whether the Indian government would perceive that as a significant challenge to its image, its international image of strength, that would require a response. So that's kind of what I was getting at with that statement.
Thank you, Toby. Thank you very much. With this, we conclude our webinar. I'll request President CASS, Chief Marshal Kaleem Sada, to give his concluding remarks and thanks the speakers, and then we will end this meeting later.
Thank you, Toby. Thank you, Shahzad. Thank you, Dr. Rabia, and all the participants who have borne with us for the last 2 hours. I apologize because we could not accommodate all the questions. And that is usually the case in a 2-hour seminar. There are 70, 80 odd participants, so there is not enough time. For those we could not entertain, our apologies. Ladies and gentlemen, the deliberations or the perspectives that have been presented today have been honest by all the 3 speakers. Toby has been asked the maximum questions for the reason that people want to know neutral perspective first, or what the others think about it. What AVM Shahzad or what Dr. Rabia would think, would have to say, some of it would be known to us. So all this while, Toby managed to explain what was new, what was normal, and what was new normal, or what was not for that matter. But suffice to say that we understand how the world looks at this problem. AVM Shahzad explained to us the Indian thinking, how it could pan out, what limitations Pakistan faced, and what could be the possible choices and challenges also. Dr. Rabia, of course, brought out her unique perspective and very forthrightly mentioned how Pakistan had not done as it should have. And she made a very important point on a lighter side. I will say that there is civilian supremacy in India because Prime Minister Modi asked the Indian Air Force Chief to hide behind the clouds while attacking Pakistan. And the Air Force Chief had no option. We followed those instructions. It would not be possible for me to go over all the important points that were made today, but suffices to say that the subject was discussed in a very wholesome manner, and all aspects of the issue were treated properly. I'll just round it up by making a few remarks of my own, that Pakistan and India relations in the past 7 decades have not had a peaceful stretch for a long time. Not because Pakistan did not want it or need it, but because India would not let it. While the whole world is drowning due to COVID-19, India still finds the opportunity, the vision, and reasons to indulge in threatening rhetoric to create additional problems as if it did not already have enough of its own. Internal Indian electoral politics have held the SAARC region hostage, where it has not been able to attain its potential trade linkages or regional integration, which could have brought prosperity all around. Megalomania and arrogance has become the hallmark of Indian policy in the region. While in the past it refused to discuss Kashmir and insisted on discussing only cross-border terrorism, now it refuses to talk at all. The consequence of this is that there is needless expense on arms purchases, while the citizens of the region are mired in poverty and misery. Annexation of Kashmir in August 2019 and Citizens Amendment Act have launched India into a very ambitious but dangerous misadventure. Their hubris has led them to daydreaming, where their military analysts think that they can walk into Azad Jammu and Kashmir and Gilgit-Baltistan at will. But they ignore that Indian occupied Kashmir is not yet under their control, and it is under extended curfew. While Azad Kashmir has a representative elected government, they believe foolishly that after making Indian Muslim citizens outcasts in their own country, they can entice Muslims of Azad Kashmir to opt to join India. They are on a path to become a bigoted, majoritarian Hindu state where minorities have no rights or security. The bamboo-wielding RSS adherents and other citizens are now being asked to join the armed forces for a 3-year duration. This is to expand and intensify the nationalistic fervor and pressurize and marginalize the minorities. What cannot be understood is why all this? How can humans be cruel to other humans, so cruel to other humans? How can humanity harbor so much of hatred for the other? Why the world is callous towards the plight of victims of crimes against humanity? Our speakers today made important points, and we value them. It remains for us to show the resolve to stand up to this madness and not be browbeaten by crazy analysts across the border. When partition, they keep touting the idea of Akhand Bharat by distorting history. When partition of British India took place, there were 562 princely states across its length and breadth. Most of those were amalgamated into the Indian Union through force, at least 12 of them against their wishes, and in contravention of the partition agreement. Kashmir was one that they couldn't do it at that time, and that has been the cause of constant conflicting claims between Pakistan and India. So the world awaits two possible extreme outcomes: the disintegration of India on one hand, as we know it, or a program to exterminate or evict 210 million Muslims from there. I wonder which one it would be and what would the world welcome. When any of the scenarios materialize, the historian will ask, was it necessary? The answer to that question would surely be a resounding and definitive no. With that, I thank you once again for your indulgence, for your patience, and for your effort that you made to enlighten us on this very important subject. I thank all the other attendees and participants for being with us. Thank you very much.
So thank you very much. Before I formally close the meeting, just a word about Center for Aerospace and Security Studies. I didn't go into detailed introduction, but for those who are attending this event, just a brief. It's a relatively new setup, Center for Aerospace and Security Studies. It's an independent think tank based at Islamabad. And somebody raised a question which I didn't include, that why Center for Aerospace is focusing on Kashmir issues. So the point is, it is Center for Aerospace and Security Studies. So anything related to security studies fall under the domain of CASS. It's relatively young, but over the last 1 year, we held around 5 national conferences and 1 international conference. And that's how we intend doing in the future also. So this is first kind of international webinar. And we are also trying to adapt to these new technologies, and hopefully we'll have more opportunities for this. So I, once again, on behalf of the CASS team,
I think
there was no other time. Yeah. Do you want to say something?
You faded out towards the end. We couldn't hear you.
Okay, my apologies. So Toby, I was just saying thank you and for being this early in the morning, because it's very early in Washington, and we enjoyed the drawings that are at the back. We know that it's your daughter's room that you borrow for webinar meetings. Thank you very much. So thank you everyone. With this, I formally close this and wish you good day. Allah Hafiz.
Thank you.